hoping in a series that we're going to begin tonight on our afternoon studies. We're going to look at a particular text in a book that somewhat represents the book itself. And that will not always be precise in nature, but for the most part, when we go through the Old Testament this year, each succeeding Bible study will be about the book of one particular scripture in the book. So your homework for next Sunday will be to read the book of Exodus. Just getting ahead of the score just a little bit there. I'm going to start with beginnings. I'm going to start by pronouncing it correctly. My son works in South Africa with the Ashley Garden congregation over there, and they have quite the mix of membership. Some of the tribal folks who have become Christians struggle sometimes. I mean, if you speak English as your first language, it's not a problem, but if it's your second or third or fourth language, it's not quite so simple. And one of the guys that was teaching the class, very sound teacher, really good guy, got up, and when he started this, he stated, in the beginning, or beginning. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but he really struggled with that first word. So Shane knew that he was in for an interesting study when you're struggling with pronouncing the words. But nevertheless, it is one of those universal texts that the entirety of any religious people understands and reads, but not everyone believes it. And that's the interesting thing about this book of beginnings. God, in order to tell us who He was, begins through Moses' writings in telling us who we are, where we came from, but also who He is. And there are several things that are pointed out just in these first few chapters, but in the entire book of Genesis, there is a long list of firsts that we will not be able to get to. And after I get finished taking all the time that I can possibly take to get through these first 5 verses, you'll know why we don't need to go through the entire book of Genesis and look at each one of them like that, because it would take a long time. But nevertheless, when you start with the very beginning, there are several things that just jump out and grab you. The first verse, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. You find listed there the beginnings of several things. Time, force, God is the force. Energy, created. The space that we live in and all the space that exists, heavens and the earth, matter. Those are 5 basic elements that describe and define everything that we are about in this existence. Now, having said that, what is really interesting is that when we go to heaven, and it's a totally different existence, a lot of these things are not going to exist in the same way like it does now. This is unique to our existence. And so when God said, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, He's telling us volumes about our existence right now. And so therefore, each one of these facets of our existence is very worth noting. But also, it is worth noting the chronology He sets up in the very beginning. We were talking just a few minutes ago, Forrest and I, about the physics of it, and so I will not be repeating what he said because I don't know the mechanical engineering portion of that. But nevertheless, there are some very simple things that can be brought out here about how we understand, for instance, and I'm going to play on time as an instance, in the beginning. That's the first time we have time, because with God, there is no such thing as time. 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years 1 day. That doesn't mean that 1 day equals 1,000 years precisely. This is a colloquialism used to describe the fact that God is not bound by the parameters of time. I don't know whether you've ever thought of it this way, but you would never be in the essence of God speaking of the past. There is no such thing. There is no such thing as the future. Those are all time constraints that we function by. As a matter of fact, and this is one we noted for us, and I was talking about just a minute ago, He said, let there be light. Okay? Well, when did He create the sun, moon, and stars? Well, it wasn't then. There was light before there were these orbs in space that we use to differentiate between day and night. But that existence of day and night existed long before those time pieces, if you will, were ever created. And so therefore there's an interesting facet here when He says, let there be light. In fact, I always go back to Romans 14. I got it marked here. Romans 4 and 9, I think. No, that's not right. Romans, I go back to it when I have it marked. Romans 4 and 17. Romans 4 and 17. This is the first indicator of who God is. It tells us kind of what his nature is, what he's about. But you'll notice in Romans 4:17, as it is written, I have made you father of many nations. He's talking about in context Abraham. But he just, and this is what's amazing too, in Romans here, this is just an aside. It is so profound, but it's just an aside in an argument he's making that's even more profound. He makes the statement, God who gives life to the dead. Well, that's what God does. Anything that's dead, he can say, let there be light, and there it is. Or let someone have life and breathe into Adam's nostrils the breath of life, and all of a sudden he's a living creature, a living being. But he says, and calls those things which are not, do not exist, as though they did. Now that's pretty fascinating, because the way we know things is through experience or through revelation. That's the only way we can know something. And people don't realize it, but imagination is not a source of knowledge. Imagination merely takes things that we know or has been revealed, and we mix them together. And I've probably used this illustration, but unicorns. How do you explain a unicorn? Well, that's somebody's imagination. Not really. It is in a part because the imagining comes from taking a walrus's tooth, which is what sticks out of his head, and you stick it on the head of a horse, and now you've got a unicorn. A unicorn, not a uniform. I speak for a living. So you got a unicorn because you took a walrus tooth and you stuck it on a horse's head. Now you got a unicorn, okay? So you're taking things that you already know. Imagination cannot invent anything. And so how do we know who God is? How do we know who we are? Other than we experience it or it has been revealed to us. One of the beauties of God's revelation is it reveals to us who we are. Because there is only so much we can experience. As a matter of fact, abstract thought is not possible in the animal world. Only humans can conceive of and understand abstract thought. And we know this as children who don't understand what sin is. Now, they know the term no. They don't always obey it. But when they discover that no is associated with pain, you tell the child no. And then you do that, they make the connection. Ooh, no means I get hurt. I don't like getting hurt. Therefore, there's the experience. Now they know something. K-N-O-W, not N-O. They know something. And so therefore we learn by what has been revealed. There's only so much we can experience. And one of the things we cannot possibly experience is the concept of God. The only way we can know is that he reveals himself to us. Genesis is the beginning of that revelation, and so therefore one of the things we learn right off the bat concerning time is that it did not exist before, because there is no time with God, and now that it does exist, it exists because God called it into being as though it already existed. That's something, that's where one of the things that people look at when they really can wrap their brain around this, they realize how puny we are as humanity. When God can just say something like it already exists, but it doesn't, but since he said it, now it does, we can't come up with anything like that. We don't have the capacity. We're not God. So we can't even have the capacity to come up with something like that. All we can work on is what we have experienced personally in our lives and what has been revealed to us by some source. Now, the question of whether that source is reliable or not is another question altogether, but we can't know it unless it's revealed or we experience it. And so what we are being told in Genesis and how the beginnings of beginnings starts are things that we could not possibly know except God has told it to us. One of the jokes that I think science claims is to go back with a theory like evolution and try to tell us that it is science. No, it's not science. You cannot test it. You weren't there to experience it. How do you know how it began? You don't. And some of the fancy theories like uniformitarianism, that everything's always like it was, so if you go backwards the way everything always was, then you'll know how long we've been here, what happened before. But we look at our own culture and our own world out here, and we see things that challenge that formula. Uniformitarianism doesn't work because things change all the time. When's the last earthquake you saw? the mountain over in Washington that blew off the side of it. I thought that was so hilarious when not that the damage it caused was hilarious, but it was hilarious. Scientists started to scamper and run sideways. You know why? Because when that volcano erupted and went down the hill, all of a sudden, the stuff they watched on film roll down that mountain became 1 million years old. Because the way they judge time from everything else in this planet, that was 1 million years old. No, we just saw it. It wasn't 1 million years old. Their dating system is flawed in evolution. So many things are wrong with that macroevolution theory. And here God is explaining to us, here's how we came to be. Here's who we are. And the only way we can know that is through revelation from somebody that was there. And by the way, Moses wasn't there either. He's merely recording God's words. God is telling us where it all came from. And what's interesting too is the chronology and the experience of that first day. You know, we can use day in several different ways, and it's used 2 different ways in this particular text, and that's where a lot of people come unglued. I'm arguing with a young man right now, or an older man right now, about when the day begins. His argument is it began in the morning, because he said day and then there's night. He named them. But Adam named the animals, but he couldn't name them because he's not God. You see, God could say, camel, there's a camel, okay? He can do that. But Adam named the animals, and he's not God, so did the animals exist before they were named? See the chronology? It's got to be that way. They exist, and they paraded before Adam, and Adam named all the animals. Well, they existed before they had names. Did that mean before they had names that's not what they were? No. God knows all things, and so that's what they were before they were named. The morning was called day, and the evening or nighttime was called night. The darkness was called night. But you will notice when he ends his text there, for the first day, you have, so the evening and the morning were the first day. Now, isn't that odd that he would say evening and morning? Because most of the time we think of evening as being defined as that brief moment of time between the daylight hours and the nighttime hours. And it's the same with morning. You know, if it's 11:30, yeah, it's kind of morning, but not really. It's way past the morning. If ever you tell somebody, yeah, I get up in the morning, well, that's kind of generic, isn't it? Do you get up in the morning at 6 o'clock, or do you get up in the morning at 11:30? You know, morning is that time that we call it night, twilight, and the morning dawn. Jesus used that. I mean, that term is used of Jesus' resurrection. And when Mary came to the tomb, she came on the dawn, or the dawning of the first day of the week, Matthew 28:1. That tells you when dawn is. It's not actually the whole day. So when you look at this text, morning and evening are representative of 2 separations. And by the way, he says the evening and the morning were the first day. How long was that first day? Well, it was 24 hours period, because the light time of a 24-hour period is day, as he named it, and the dark time is called night. And they existed before he named them, and because he named day and then night doesn't mean that day existed before night. And so therefore, evening and morning were the first day. Now, why do you think that is the case? Well, if you go back to verse 2, the earth as it existed, as God has created the heavens and the earth, is without form and void. And what was all over everywhere? Darkness. And why is that? Because evening comes first. That's why the Jewish folk count time from 6 p.m. in an evening when it gets dark and goes on to the next day. That's why the Romish time that Caesar put in order started at midnight, because it's really dark at midnight and then goes forward. And the consistency of that allows us to understand that when Mary came with the stuff to put on Jesus and fix his body so it didn't stink, she brought those things, and it was the dawning of the first day of the week, which tells us that Jesus rose right before the dawning of the first day of the week. Not on the Sabbath, because Mark says point blank it was after the Sabbath. So therefore time was set up by God. In fact, later on there's a lot more detail when you get into the heavenly bodies and what they were there for. And one of the points I would make here is that when you look at 7 24-hour time frames in the creation week, that's how long they were. And the reason I say that, if you'll turn over with me to Exodus in the 20th chapter, and let's look at a couple of phrases there where Moses, the same guy that wrote Genesis by inspiration, and telling them, here's the deal. And you'll look at in verse 8. There's a long list of verses there, 2 or 3 verses, that talk about remembering the Sabbath to keep it holy, and what all is involved in keeping the Sabbath. But you will notice the analogy made by God. Here's the time frame situation, okay? You'll notice, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, and the sea, and all that is in them. My question is, how much was made outside those 6 days? Well, if God knows how to speak English, or Hebrew, or any language, all is a universal positive statement. That means there is nothing outside those 6 days that was created. Okay? Nothing that exists anywhere, including aliens. Okay? Nothing exists and was created outside those 6 days. Now, how do you think a Jewish person coming out of Egypt, understanding the rising and falling of the sun and the cycle of the sun and the moon and so forth, what in their mind did they think a day was? 24-hour day is a 24-hour day. So therefore, if God makes the connection between the two and says, yeah, I made everything in 6 days, rested on the 7th, and then I blessed the Sabbath day to hallow it, were they keeping long eons of time? I get tickled sometimes when people try to accommodate science, falsely so-called, instead of just looking at what the Bible says. And you know, you could go all the way from the Hebrew, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but any yokel can look it up in a dictionary. Yom, Y-O-M, Yom is the term for day. Used over 100 times in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. Every time it's used with a numeric value beside it, it means 24 hours. Every time. No exceptions. So in the first part there, when you see the first day, really? First. That's a numeric value. What kind of day are we looking at? 24 hours. And isn't it interesting that it began with the evening and then the morning? Well, in verse 2, everything was dark till God said, let there be light. And even though the name day is used in the second phrase there, in the second or third verse, fourth verse, where he called these things certain things, they existed before he named them day and night. And so therefore, our time frames today are very consistently the daylight hours, the nighttime hours, and between the two of them, you got 24 hours. And that's what that verse says in verse 5. The consummation between, it's like a math problem. You know, you add evening and you add morning, and what do you get? 24-hour day. And it's interesting that in a figurative way, that's what these things are used for, because in all other references to both evening and morning, it never does mean 24 hours or 12 hours. It means a brief moment in between two 12-hour existent time frames. Morning is always like a dawn time. Twilight is what you call the time right before it gets pitch dark. But in this instance, it's used 5 or 6 times, and I can't remember the verses, 5, 9, 13, I can't remember, but you can see them in the verse in chapter 1. And he says, here's the days, 24-hour days. And all of those terms are yom. Now, the 3 ways in which word a day is used is the day, as in daylight, because God used that in this verse. Day is what you call the daylight. We talk about that and use that term in that way. But also day can mean 24 hours, okay? And that 24-hour time frame is what he's talking about again in verse 5. Those two in verse 4 and verse 5, he uses day in those 2 different ways. Now, we also can use day in another way when we say back in the day. That means an indefinite amount of time. Now, what a lot of folks, in order to accommodate evolution, is trying to tell you is that you can go to this day that's used in verse 5 and say, oh, it's an indeterminately long amount of time. Is that what the Israelites understood? Were they working for 6 undetermined long periods of time, and then for a long period of indeterminate time they were going to rest? No. And so therefore the Bible matches itself. This is just one small facet of the beginnings that are mentioned. Oh, we don't have time to go into Cain and Abel and worship and all of the things that God reveals to us about how he wants us to worship. We don't even have time in the same chapter to look at the nature of God when he says in verse 26, let us make man in our image. I don't like using the term Trinity. That's not a Bible term. Godhead is. But when we speak of the Godhead, and there's three of them, persons of the Godhead, they are all God, the Father, Son, and the Spirit, as we are told to baptize people into it in Matthew 28:19. So, all of these things are first. They are revelations, and all throughout the book of Genesis, I highly recommend you read it before you read Exodus for next week. But when you read it, you will find, just notice the times when something is mentioned, and it's the first time ever that man understood a revelation from God of some bit of knowledge that never has been broached before. He introduces it. Genesis is a book of beginnings. And this is just one example, this time frame thing. It's so consistent, it's so easily understood. But again, it's a book of beginnings. And our worship, our souls, our eternal destiny, the fact that we have a job in this planet, on this planet to work, our activities, how we're made. I mean, the psalmist would say, I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. There are texts in this book that show us how we're made and what's so fantastic and so incredible about our body, about our physical being. This is a book of beginnings. If you want to go back to the beginning, beginning, that's the way the guy said it. In the beginning, he was having struggles getting that beginning down. But you know what? Everybody understood, and a rose by any other name is still a rose. I mean, if you look at Genesis, it is the beginning of God expressing himself to us and us understanding not only who God is, but who we are. And so I hope that's been useful for you. I think there's a lot more that we could have gone into if I'd had all 6 hours, and I could use them all on Genesis. But God has revealed himself, and of late he has revealed himself through his Son the last 2,000 years, because Jesus came to this earth. And another phrase, and I'll close with this, in John 1:1, has a similar phraseology. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We're living in a time when we know who God is because he's revealed himself to us. And if you're not part of his life, if you're not doing things the way he wants you to do them, I would greatly encourage you, read the beginnings and realize that we wouldn't know who we are even if it were not for God revealing to us who we are and what we need to do. So if you're not doing that, you need to respond to the invitation in any way. We always invite you to stand and sing. Lord, you be free from the